Good evening and welcome back. Settle in. Lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight. Only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. It is the morning of the 25th of September, 1066, and the most experienced warrior in the world is enjoying the sunshine. He is 51 years old and stands, by every account, head and shoulders above other men. He has fought from the Norwegian snows to the sands of Sicily. He has commanded the palace guard of Constantinople, seen an emperor blinded, escaped a Byzantine prison, carried home the wealth of the East, and worn the crown of Norway for 20 years. His name is Harald Sigurdsson, called Hardrada, Hard Counsel, the Hard Ruler. And 5 days ago, he shattered an English army and received the surrender of York. Today is administrative, a warm autumn day, a hostage exchange at a river crossing east of the city. It is so hot and the war so nearly won that he has told a third of his army to stay with the ships, and the rest have left their mail shirts behind. Then on the road from York, a cloud of dust, and beneath it, points of light, like a field of broken ice, the saga says, glittering. An army is coming, the wrong army. An army that should be 250 miles to the south and is instead an hour away and moving fast. The Viking Age has ended in many places at many times in this series, but if it ended on a single day, this is the day. Tonight, the last Viking, the full, impossible life of Harald Hardrada, and the 3-week September that closed the age. Begin 36 years earlier with a 15-year-old bleeding in a Norwegian forest. Harald was a king's half-brother in an age when that was a dangerous relation. Olaf Haraldsson, King Olaf the Stout, as his contemporaries knew him, Saint Olaf, as all Scandinavia would soon know him, had spent a decade forcing Christianity and a single crown onto Norway's quarrelsome chieftains until his enemies and the Danish king drove him into exile in the east. In 1030 he came back over the mountains with a scratch army to reclaim his kingdom, and his teenage half-brother marched with him. Over the protests, tradition says, of everyone sensible. At Stiklestad, north of Trondheim, the peasant levies of Norway met their once and future saint. The men Olaf had bullied toward heaven, arrayed against him in their thousands. The battle was fought under a strange darkness that chroniclers would later link to an eclipse. The king went down beneath 3 great wounds, and his army broke. Harald, 15, took a wound and would have died on the field but for a stubborn companion who dragged him away, hid him at a remote farm, and smuggled him east over the mountains when he could ride. In the sagas, Harald composes his first surviving verse on that ride. Rye already. Now the forest must shelter him, who yesterday marched with a king. And who knows, it ends. My name may yet be wide enough in the world. The dead king's afterlife deserves its paragraph because all Norway's politics and Harald's own legitimacy would grow from that grave. Olaf's body, buried secretly in sandy ground by the Nidelva River, was exhumed a year later before witnesses. Incorrupt, the clergy declared, hair and nails still growing, and the bishop enshrined him at once. Miracles multiplied. The Danish puppet regime his enemies had installed collapsed within 5 years under the weight of its own unpopularity and the martyr's memory, and the shrine at Nidaros, Trondheim, grew into the great pilgrimage church of the north, with Olaf proclaimed, in a phrase that entered Norwegian law, the country's eternal king. Every later claimant, Harald included, would rule in some sense as the saint's deputy. The Viking Age had produced many royal corpses. This was the first one that kept working after death. Note the pattern set at Stiklestad, because it will hold for 36 years. Total defeat refused as a conclusion. And note what happened to the dead king, because it changed the north. Within a year, miracle stories were gathering around Olaf's grave. Within a generation, the church had made him a saint, and Norway had made him its eternal king, the violent half-pagan country's own royal martyr. The Viking Age's gods, we will find at this story's end, did not go down fighting. They were, so to speak, promoted out of existence. And the process was already underway, as the future last Viking limped east into exile. Harald's Road East was the road our third episode paved, down the river roads of the Rus to the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev, where an exiled Norse princeling with a sword was a familiar and useful commodity. He fought some years in Yaroslav's service and conceived an ambition above his station, the Grand Prince's daughter, Elisaveta. The verses he addressed to her, some of the few Norse love poems with a named author and object, run on a rueful refrain. He has done this and that deed of note across the world, and yet a goddess of the gold rings in Garderik disdains me. He was, for the moment, a landless teenager with a famous dead brother. Yaroslav, dinners to his fingertips, declined, but kept the door open. Fortunes, after all, could change. And Constantinople, where fortunes changed fastest, lay at the river road's end. So Harald went to Miklagard and joined the Varangian Guard, and rose within a few years to command it. The Byzantine sources wonderfully confirm him. A manual of imperial advice, written a generation later, cites Araltes, brother of the King of Norway, who came with 500 warriors, served loyally in Sicily and Bulgaria, and was honoured with court titles. A foreign prince who did not complain, the author marvels, at earning his rank. The sagas, characteristically, prefer the deeds and the loot, campaigns against Arab corsairs, and through the towns of Sicily under the great general Georgios Maniakes, with whom Harald's relations were, the tradition insists, poisonous. Tricks and stratagems by the dozen, including the old fable of taking a town by feigning his own death and being carried through the gates in a coffin. And 18 major engagements worth of plunder, shipped north batch by batch to Yaroslav's safekeeping, the medieval world's most reliable offshore account. The sagas garland the Sicilian years with stratagems. 4 separate towns taken by 4 separate tricks, including one captured by sparrows sent home under fire shavings, a tale you will remember from Olga of Kiev 2 episodes ago. The fable migrated wherever a cunning commander needed dressing. More historically nourishing are the verses. Harald composed throughout his life, and 16 of his stanzas survive under the charming title of the Gaman Visur, the joking verses. Each one listing his accomplishments: fighting, riding, swimming, skiing, shooting, rowing, harp playing and poetry in one famous catalogue. And each ending on the same rueful hook: we met in Kiev, and still the goddess of the gold rings in Russia disdains me. A future king of Norway, drafting and redrafting a poetic cover letter for a princess in barracks from Sicily to the Bosphorus. The Middle Ages offer few more human documents. His Byzantine exit was the wildest chapter of all, and here even sober historians lean in. In 1042, the young Emperor Michael V overthrew the Empress Zoe, adoptive mother, co-ruler, and the dynasty's living legitimacy. and the city rose against him in one of Constantinople's periodic volcanic riots. The mob and the palace factions won. The deposed emperor was dragged from sanctuary, and his eyes were put out. A Byzantine mercy, disqualifying rather than killing. The Norse tradition is unanimous and specific. The Varangians did the blinding, and Harald led them. His poets boasted of it for the rest of his life. The king who left an emperor eyeless. Shortly afterward, accused variously of misappropriating imperial plunder or presuming toward a princess, Harald was imprisoned and escaped, the saga says, when a pious lady, prompted by Saint Olaf in a dream, lowered ropes into the cell. He roused his Varangians, seized 2 galleys, and rowed for the harbour chain, the great iron boom across the Golden Horn. His trick has delighted naval historians ever since. Full speed at the chain, all hands and cargo aft to lift the bows. Then, as the ships rowed up onto the iron, everyone scrambling forward to seesaw them over. 1 galley broke its back and spilled its crew. Harold's tipped over the chain and away up the Bosphorus into the Black Sea night, with the fortune of the East aboard and Kiev ahead. Yaroslav, presented with the returning hero now floating on Byzantine gold, reconsidered. Harold and Elisaveta were married that winter. Whatever else the age offers, it has no better arc of persistence. The disdained exile came back for his princess with an emperor's ransom and the guard's back pay. 15 years, 1 poem, kept like an invoice. The homecoming negotiation itself became one of the saga's set-piece scenes. Uncle and nephew met aboard ship, and Harald had his Byzantine treasure carried out and poured across an ox hide on the deck. Gold in quantities, the saga swears, that no man in the northern lands had seen in one place before. Magnus, in answer, could offer only what a young king of 2 poor countries had, a single gold arm ring, and the observation, made gently by a ruler wondering aloud, that it was strange for the uncle to have all the gold and the nephew all the land. The exchange, whether it happened in those words or only should have, is the whole 11th century North in one image, the old world's wealth measured in rings, the new world's in kingdoms, and Harald, who intended to hold both, counting out his purchase price on an ox hide. Harald came home to Norway in 1045, rich enough to buy a war and connected enough not to need one. Quite. His nephew Magnus, Saint Olaf's son, now ruled Norway and Denmark both. Confronted by an uncle with limitless silver and a Kievan alliance, he cut the deal the age's politics demanded, half of Norway now, in exchange for half of Harald's treasure. 2 years later, Magnus died young, after naming, with tidy inconvenience, 2 heirs, Norway to Harald, and Denmark to the Danish claimant, Svein Estridsson. Harald took the Norwegian half and spent nearly 2 decades trying to collect the other, in a grinding annual war of coastal burnings. Hedeby, the North's great market town, went up in flames that the Skald watched from the harbour. And indecisive fleet battles, until even Harald conceded the pointlessness, made peace and looked for a worthier prize. The Danish War did produce one night the Skalds never let go of, the sea battle at the Nissø River mouth in 1062, fought almost uniquely in the age's records. In darkness, fleet lashed to fleet in the old style, fighting across the gunwales by starlight until past midnight, when Sweyn's line broke and 70 Danish ships drifted empty. Sweyn himself escaped. He always escaped. His talent for losing battles and keeping his kingdom exhausted stronger men than Harald. and the war sputtered out in mutual weariness. But for one August night, the last generation of the Longship Age fought the kind of battle their great-grandfathers would have recognised, prow to prow in the dark, and the poets aboard took notes. At home, meanwhile, he earned the byname. Hardrada, hard counsel, the hard ruler, was not a compliment, and the sagas do not soften him. Chieftains who resisted the crown's reach were burned out or broken. Regional assemblies that defied him learned better. His court poets, whom he collected and judged with the professional's ear, he was, everyone agreed, a fine poet himself, celebrated a king whose word was iron either way, in gift or in vengeance. He founded a trading town in a sheltered bay that would grow into Oslo. He pushed the church, minted coin, hardened the state his brother the saint had sketched. Norway under Harald was what the whole north was becoming. A European kingdom, centralised, Christian, taxed, built by the most Viking figure alive. The age was ending in his own hands, and one suspects he half knew it. The raider's world of open doors was gone, closed by exactly such kings as himself. For a man of his appetites, only one door of the old size remained anywhere in the north. England. How hard Harold's rule could cut. One killing shows. Einar Tambuskelfir, Paunch Shaker, the great bowman of the old wars, now the mightiest chieftain of the Trondheim country and self-appointed keeper of St. Olaf's legacy, made himself the crown's chief obstruction, packing assemblies and springing accused men from the king's own courts. Summoned with his son to talk terms in the royal hall, Einar walked into darkness, the hall's lights doused, and father and son were cut down at the threshold by the king's men. It was murder at a parley, medieval politics at its barest. The countryside seethed and settled because there was no one left of Einar's size to lead it. Hard counsel, the byname said. Norway had gotten precisely the state building its neighbours had, a knife's width less gently. In the first week of 1066, Edward the Confessor, England's pious, childless old king, died at Westminster and the door swung wide. England was the jewel of the north, rich beyond any Scandinavian kingdom, administratively precocious and dynastically a tangle, having spent the century passing between English and Danish kings. For England too had its Viking Age climax within living memory. Not the Great, the Danish conqueror who had ruled England, Denmark and Norway as one North Sea empire, dead only 30 years. Every strong man around the sea could construct a claim. The English council crowned the obvious one, Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, no royal blood, but the kingdom's chief soldier and statesman on the spot. Across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy declared the throne promised to him, and Harold his forsworn vassal, and began building ships. And in Norway, Harald Hardrada dusted off the thinnest claim of the three. A treaty said to have been sworn a generation earlier between his nephew Magnus and England's then king, each to inherit if the other died heirless, which by aggressive arithmetic made England his. Thin claims need thick allies, and Harold's arrived embittered and well informed. Tostig Godwinson, the new English king's own brother, lately Earl of Northumbria until his earldom rose against his harsh rule, and his brother, choosing peace over family, let him fall. Tostig had spent the exile since shopping for a patron against his brother. In Norway, the sagas have him flatter the old lion expertly. Tostig, for his part, had already spent the spring failing on his own account. With the fleet scraped together in Flanders, he had raided the south coast, been chased north, tried a landing in Lincolnshire, where the local earls broke his force so thoroughly that his fleet deserted him, and limped to Scotland with a dozen ships to wait out the summer as the Scots king's guest. It matters for what followed. By the time he stood at Harold's elbow, Tostig was not a partner bringing an army. He was a beggar bringing a map, a claim to legitimacy in the north, and an exile's certainty, fatal, infectious, that England would rise to welcome them. Advisors with everything to regain and nothing left to lose have sunk more fleets than weather. That summer, Harold staked everything. A fleet the sources call 300 ships, the levies of Norway, his household, his banner. A white silk standard named Landwaster, which he held luck itself, down to Shetland and Orkney, gathering strength, then south onto the Yorkshire coast, burning as tradition required. On the 20th of September, at Fulford outside York, the Earls of the English North met him with their levies and were broken in a marsh. A real, bloody, full-scale battle that history barely remembers because of what the next 5 days did to it. York opened its gates. Hostages were arranged from the Shire to be delivered a few days on. At a crossing east of the city where roads met, Stamford Bridge. The sagas send the fleet off under a freight of omens, and whatever their historicity, they are the tradition's own verdict, composed with hindsight's full knowledge. One man dreams of a great troll woman standing before the fleet with a carrion knife and trough, chanting that she sensed the king's doom. Another sees the ship's prows crowded with ravens and eagles, and a she-wolf on every headland fed before the fleet sails. Harold himself, in the darkest of the dreams, meets his dead brother, the Saint, who warns him plainly that death waits in the west. Troll-ridden England, the phrase runs, is not for him. The historical Harold, of course, sailed anyway. The Harold of the sagas sails anyway too, which is the point. The North told this story afterward the way the Greeks told of heroes. The doom visible, the greatness ingoing regardless. What Harold did not know, what no commander of the age would have believed, was what the other Harold was doing. Harold Godwinson had spent the summer watching the Channel for William, his real fear. When the North exploded, his southern army had just stood down, its provisions exhausted. He remustered it and marched it north, London to Yorkshire, some 185 miles in roughly 5 days, gathering shire levies as he came. One of the great forced marches of medieval history, an army moving at the speed of rumour. On the evening of the 24th, he was in Tadcaster. York spared occupation, quietly let him through at dawn. The Norwegians at Stamford Bridge, sunning themselves among the hostage cattle with their mail 7 miles away at the ships, looked up on the morning of the 25th and saw the dust. Weather, it should be said, was the invisible player in the whole Triple campaign, and it played to the end for William. All summer, the Norman invasion fleet had sat windbound in its river mouths, while Harold's English army watched the coast. It was that same stubborn northerly, foul for Normandy, fair for Norway, that carried Hardrada across from the Orkneys, forced Harold to march his weary levies north instead, and then, with timing no dramatist would dare, swung round to the south in the very days after Stamford Bridge, releasing William onto an undefended coast while England's army stood victorious, exhausted, and 250 miles out of position. Historians rightly resist explaining 1066 by luck alone, but no honest account of it leaves out the wind. The saga gives the day a last parley, and whether or not the words were ever spoken, the North treasured them too much for this episode to omit. 20 horsemen ride out from the English lines. Their leader calls for Tostig and offers him, from his brother the king, peace, pardon, and his earldom back. And for Harald of Norway, Tostig asks, "What will you give?" The rider answers, 7 feet of English ground, or as much more as he is taller than other men. The horsemen turn back. Harald, watching, asks who spoke so well. Tostig replies, "That was Harold Godwinson himself." The last Viking's recorded response is professional admiration. "A little man," he says, but he stood proudly in his stirrups. Fulford, 5 days earlier, had been won by veteran patience. The young English earls, Edwin and Morcar, had drawn up with the river on one flank and Marsh on the other and attacked the Norwegian line at its weakest end. And Harold had let that wing bend backward, absorbing the push at his rawest troops until the English advance had stretched itself along the front. Then Landwaster came forward at the strong end, and the whole veteran mass wheeled through the hinge. The English, pressed into the marsh, died in numbers, the chroniclers measured, with a dreadful image. The causeway of bodies, over which they said the Norwegians could cross dry-shod. It was a masterclass, the last great set-piece victory of the Viking Age, and its completeness is half the explanation for Stamford Bridge. An army that has just annihilated the Norse levies, taken the Norse capital, and dictated terms does not easily imagine, 5 days later, that anything is left in England to surprise it. The battle that followed was long, chaotic, and, for the Norwegians, catastrophic, and its stages come down to us in fragments English and Norse. The English tradition kept the bridge itself, a single giant, Norse axeman, holding the narrow crossing alone, while the army scrambled to form up beyond. 40 English dead by his hand, says one account, until a soldier drifted under the bridge in a swill tub and speared him from below through the planks. The Norse tradition kept its king, Harold in the shield wall's front in his blue tunic, fight and bear of mail in the heat. His hauberk, which he had named Emma, folded uselessly at Rickle with the ships, until an arrow took him through the throat, and the man who had survived Stiklestad, Sicily, the palace revolutions of Byzantium, and 20 years of Baltic War went down on a Yorkshire riverbank with his ambition an hour wide. Landwaster passed to Tostig, who refused the quarter his brother, the sources suggest, offered even then, and died under his own choice. Late in the day, the men from the ships arrived at a dead run in their mail. Orry Storm, the Norse called that last charge, for the captain who led it, fought to astonishment and broke in their turn. Between the bridge's fall and the day's end came the phases the traditions half preserve. The Norwegian shield ring on the rising ground, Landwaster at its centre, holding through assault after assault under the September sun. The saga's controversial English cavalry, perhaps a memory of mounted household troops, perhaps a Norse storyteller dressing the battle in Hastings clothes, breaking against the spears and wheeling away. Harold's last fury, both hands on his sword, out ahead of the wall where no armour was anyway. And after the arrow found him, the strange hours pause in the slaughter, almost a truce, while the armies drew breath around his body, before Tostig took up the banner and refused the final offer, and the storm of Ori's ship companies arrived, magnificent and useless, to die with the rest. The saga gives the day its epitaph in Harald's own manner, a verse he supposedly spoke that morning, then rejected as poor work and recomposed better. We never kneel in battle before the storm of weapons. So commanded the word true woman of the Hawk's high land. Even his last poem got an edit. It was that kind of mind. The numbers tell the ending better than any scene. The fleet that came to England, the Chronicle says, filled 300 ships. The survivors, granted peace by an exhausted victor who marched them to the coast under oath never to return, needed 24 to carry them home. Among those spared, Harald's son Olaf, who would rule Norway long and so peacefully that history calls him Olaf the Quiet. The age's ambitions in England were not merely defeated at Stamford Bridge, they were extinguished in an afternoon at a ratio the North could neither replace nor forget. The peace granted at Rickhall had its own quiet dignities. Among those spared, besides the Prince Olaf, were the Earl of Orkney and the young men of a dozen island families. The wounded were suffered to be gathered, and the oath exacted, friendship and no return in arms, was remarkably kept. No Norwegian royal fleet ever again sailed against England. The dead of Stamford Bridge were left to the ravens the omens had promised, and the English buried them at their leisure. Travellers reported the whitening bones on the field for a generation. As for the Hard King himself, England held him only briefly. A year later, his son was permitted to carry the body home, where it was buried in the church Harald himself had raised in Trondheim, and later moved as churches rose and fell. His grave today is uncertain, somewhere, most likely, under a paved street of the city, which the old Varangian, who had slept in stranger places, might have found fitting enough. Even the arithmetic of the disaster was remembered in ships. 300 sails had come over from Norway that autumn, the chronicles agree. When Olaf gathered the survivors at Rickhall and the English let them go, 24 ships sufficed to carry every man still living home. Whole districts of western Norway, the sagas say, had no grown men come back at all. The levy rolls of a generation had gone into the Aus and the meadow by the Derwent. Norway did not fight another aggressive war for a lifetime, not because her kings grew gentle, but because the country needed 30 years simply to grow the men. Harold Godwinson had 3 days to feel like the saviour of England. Then a rider from the south, the wind in the Channel had turned, and William of Normandy was ashore in Sussex, building a castle. The exhausted royal army about faced, and marched the length of England a second time. On the 14th of October, on a hill near Hastings, it formed its shield wall once more, the same wall that had broken the Norwegians, thin now by them, and held it against the Norman cavalry from morning until dusk, when the arrows and the feigned retreats finally opened it, and Harold fell beneath his standards with his brothers and his housecarls around him. 3 kings had contested the year. By nightfall on the 14th of October, 2 were dead, and the 3rd was William the Conqueror. England's year had one more scene of grim theatre in it. William was crowned at Westminster on Christmas Day, 1066, and even the coronation went to the age's dark rhythm. When the congregation inside roared its acclamation in 2 languages, The Norman guards outside took the noise for an uprising and began setting fire to the neighbouring houses. The service finished, chroniclers say, in smoke and half-empty pews. The new king trembling at his own altar while London burned around the abbey. The conquest would go on in that key for years, rebellion and castle, harrying and Domesday ledger. But that is another country story now, and other evenings. And here the series' last irony asks to be unfolded gently, because it is perfect. Who were these Normans, the men whose conquest ended English resistance and closed our story's frame? The name says it plainly, Northmen. 150 years earlier, a Viking warlord named Rollo, a raider of the Seine out of the same world as every fleet in this series, had been bought off by a Frankish king with the old desperate coin, land at the river mouth, baptism and a title, on condition he keep other Vikings out. His descendants had traded longships for war horses and Norse for French inside 3 generations, becoming the most formidably organised warrior aristocracy in Europe. But the Duke who won Hastings was Rollo's great-great-great-grandson. In the year 1066, England was invaded twice by 2 branches of the same Norse expansion, the one that had stayed Viking and the one that had evolved. The old model died at Stamford Bridge. The new one took the kingdom 19 days later, and from it in time would come the England whose language and law and restlessness spread across the world. The Viking Age did not exactly end in 1066. It won, wearing a different helmet. A word, finally, on how we know any of tonight, because the debt is specific. The scenes of Harald's life come principally through Snorri Sturluson's Great Chronicle of Norway's Kings, written in Iceland around 1230, 160 years after Stamford Bridge. From older written lives, now mostly lost, and above all from the skaldic verses composed by eyewitness court poets, which Snorri quotes like footnotes. His method was startlingly modern. Verse, he explains in his preface, is evidence, because a poem recited before the king and his men could not lie about deeds they had all seen. Flattery, yes. Invention, no. Between the poem's bedrock and Snorri's narrative bridging, the reader must pick a path, and historians have argued over every plank. We have walked it tonight the way this series always does. The verifiable told plainly, the legends told as legends, and the whole of it told with gratitude that a farmer chieftain on a subarctic island thought the memory worth the calfskin. As for the world of the dragon ships itself, it did not so much fall as settle. The 3 Scandinavian crowns hardened into ordinary European kingdoms, their fleets now royal navies, their raiders now taxpayers. The Christianization Olaf died for at Stiklestad completed itself within the century. The old gods fading into folklore, the ship burials into churchyards, though Thor's hammers were still being cast in the same moulds as crosses for a cautious generation or 2. Out on the Atlantic rim, the age lingered longest. Norse earls ruled Orkney for centuries more. The Icelandic Commonwealth argued its law at the Althing until the 1260s. Norse Greenland, as we heard last night, kept its lamps lit into the 1400s. And in Iceland, as the sea roads quieted, the grandchildren of the age did the thing for which this whole series is in their debt. They wrote it all down. Snorri Sturluson, chieftain, politician, and the North's great historian, composing the very saga of Harald, whose scenes we have retold tonight, preserving the kings and the verses, the gods and the ship funerals, on calfskin, on a farm, in the long dark of the northern winter. Hold the whole arc a moment as we close the series. It began on a June morning in 793, with monks watching sails they could not read, and it ends on a September afternoon in 1066, with the Norse army watching English dust it could not believe. The surprise attack from the sea undone at the last by a surprise attack by land, in between Alfred in his marsh, Ibn Fadlan on his riverbank, Gudrid rocking a cradle in Vinland, Halfdan scratching his name in Hagia Sophia's marble. The fury of the Northmen turned out to be many things the litany never guessed. Merchants and lawgivers, poets and parliament founders, the makers of Russia and Normandy and Iceland's literature, and yes, always the axes. No single ending could hold all of that. But the North itself chose its ending image long ago, and it is the right one. The tallest man of the age offered exactly 7 feet of English ground, and taking it. Harald's body, after a year, was carried home and buried in Trondheim, in church ground by the rites of the White Christ, like the Christian king he also was. The age of the Northmen was over. The world it made, from the Volga to Newfoundland, was just getting started. Thank you for wandering these 5 northern evenings with me, from Lindisfarne Stone to Stamford Bridge, and for every evening of every series before them. That is where we will leave it tonight. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again.